The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the city streets like an endless symphony of sorrow. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the wet pavement, and the world felt unusually quiet, too quiet for a place that never truly slept. It was the kind of night where most people would be curled up in the warmth of their homes, far away from the cold, merciless downpour. But amidst the stillness, a desperate voice broke through the silence. A scream, faint at first, but urgent, filled with panic and fear. James Carter, a self-made millionaire, had been driving home from a late-night business meeting, his luxury car gliding smoothly over the slick road. The windshield wipers worked tirelessly, but the rain blurred his vision, making it hard to see beyond a few feet ahead. He barely noticed the figure at first, just a shadowy blur on the side of the road. But then, another cry. This time he was sure of it. Someone was screaming. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he slowed down. His first instinct was to ignore it. This wasn't his problem. He had places to be, deals to close, a world that expected him to be sharp and decisive. Stopping in the middle of nowhere for a stranger, that wasn't something he did. But something about that voice, it cut through him, unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. As he pulled over and lowered his window, the cold air rushed in, mixed with the sound of rain hammering against the car. Then he saw him, a boy, no older than 10 or 11, drenched to the bone, his clothes clinging to his small frame. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face was streaked with a mixture of rain and tears. He was standing in the middle of the road, arms flailing, screaming for help like his life depended on it. James hesitated for a second. He had spent years building a life where he didn't get involved in other people's problems. But something about this kid, the sheer terror in his eyes, made it impossible to just drive away. "What's wrong?" James called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. The boy ran up to the car, breathless and shaking. "Please, sir, you have to help. My brother, he's hurt. I don't know what to do." James frowned, his pulse quickening. "Where is he?" The boy pointed toward a dark alleyway just beyond the streetlights, where the city seemed to dissolve into shadows. A place most people wouldn't dare step into, especially at this hour. Every rational thought in James's mind screamed at him to turn away. He had heard enough stories. People getting lured into traps, criminals preying on the chosen kindness of strangers. And yet, looking at the boy, he couldn't ignore the raw desperation in his voice. James exhaled sharply, pushing open the car door. The cold rain hit him instantly, soaking through his expensive suit, but he barely noticed. "Show me," he said. The boy wasted no time, grabbing James's hand and pulling him toward the alley. James followed, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. With each step, the darkness seemed to swallow them whole. Something about this didn't feel right, but by the time he realized it, it was too late. The shadows had already closed in around him. James followed the boy deeper into the alley, his footsteps splashing against puddles that reflected the dim glow of the streetlights behind them. The deeper they went, the colder it seemed to get, the buildings on either side pressing in like silent watchers. A strange feeling crawled up his spine, an unease he couldn't shake, but the boy's grip on his hand was tight, his pace frantic. Whatever was waiting for them ahead, James had already crossed the point of turning back. Then he saw it. A figure lay slumped against the damp brick wall, barely visible in the shadows. Another boy, slightly older, his face pale and twisted pain. His clothes were soaked through, but it wasn't just the rain. A dark stain spread across his side, his breathing uneven. James dropped to his knees beside him. "What happened?" he asked, his voice firm but laced with concern. The younger boy, still trembling, struggled to answer. We were running, he stammered. Some men, they were chasing us. My brother, he got hurt, his voice cracked, and fresh tears welled in his eyes. James's mind raced. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had done this, and judging by the fear in the boy's voice, they might still be nearby. His instincts screamed at him to get out of there, to take the boys and leave before whoever had hurt them returned. He carefully placed a hand on the older boy's shoulder. "Hey, stay with me," he urged. "Can you move?" The boy groaned, barely able to lift his head. James clenched his jaw. This was bad. He needed help, an ambulance, the police, something. He reached into his pocket for his phone. But before he could dial, a noise made him freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the alley. The younger boy flinched, his grip tightening on James's sleeve. "They're coming," he whispered. James turned sharply, his eyes scanning the darkness. A figure emerged from the far end of the alley. Then another, and another. 3 men, dressed in dark clothing, their faces shadowed, their presence radiating danger. James felt his pulse hammer, in his throat. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easily, but this was different. He wasn't dealing with some business rival or a bad investment. This was real, and he had 2 kids, depending on him. One of the men stepped forward, his voice, calm but laced with menace. "You should walk away," he said. "This isn't your problem." James straightened, forcing himself to remain composed. "The kid is hurt," he said, keeping his voice even. "He needs a hospital." The man chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down James's spine. "That's unfortunate," he said. "But like I said, not your problem." James's hands curled into fists. He had built his fortune by being sharp, by making the right moves at the right time. But this was something money couldn't fix. He could see it in the way the men stood, in the cold, detached way they looked at the injured boy. Whoever they were, they weren't about to just let him go. The younger boy clung to him, eyes wide with terror. James felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a responsibility beyond himself. He wasn't walking away, but the men were getting closer, and James knew he was running out of time. He needed a plan, fast. And then, out of nowhere, the sound of a distant siren cut through the rain. It was faint, but enough to make the men hesitate. James didn't know if it was luck or fate, but he wasn't about to waste it. He grabbed the younger boy's hand and hoisted the injured one up, supporting his weight as best as he could. "Run!" he ordered. The younger boy didn't hesitate. He bolted, and James followed, his heart pounding as they sprinted toward the streetlights, toward safety. Behind them, the men shouted, but they didn't chase. The sirens were getting closer. James didn't stop until they reached his car. He threw open the door, ushered the boys inside, and slid behind the wheel, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. As he sped off, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The alley was swallowed by darkness once more. The men were gone, but something told him this wasn't over. Not even close. James drove through the rain-slicked streets, his mind racing as fast as his car. The 2 boys sat in the back, drenched and shaken, the younger one clutching his brother's arm, as if afraid to let go. The injured boy barely made a sound, his head resting against the seat, his face pale. James stole a glance at them through the rearview mirror. He still didn't know exactly what had happened, or why those men were after them. But one thing was clear. These boys were in serious trouble, and now, so was he. The sirens he'd heard earlier had faded, leaving only the sound of the rain. and the hum of the engine. He knew he couldn't just take the kids to a hospital and leave them there. What if those men followed? What if this was bigger than just some random attack? He needed answers. "Kid," James said, his voice steady, despite the tension in his chest. "Who were those men?" The younger boy hesitated, staring down at his lap. "I don't know their names," he whispered, "but they've been looking for us for a long time." James frowned. "Why?" The boy swallowed hard. "Because of our dad." A silence settled over the car, heavier than the storm outside. James didn't press further, sensing the weight of whatever story lay behind those words. But one thing was certain. These kids were running from something far bigger than just a bad night on the streets. He turned the car down a quieter road, away from the main city, his mind working fast. He needed somewhere safe, somewhere those men wouldn't think to look. Then it hit him, his old cabin. It had been years since he'd last gone there. A secluded place on the outskirts of town, meant for escaping the chaos of business and wealth. Now it would have to be a hiding place. By the time they arrived, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the sky was beginning to lighten. James helped the older boy inside, settling him on the couch while the younger one hovered nearby. He grabbed a first aid kit from the cabinet, his hands moving quickly but carefully as he cleaned the wound. It was deep, but not fatal. With some rest, the boy would recover. As James wrapped the bandage around the boy's side, the younger one finally spoke again. "Our dad, he got mixed up with the wrong people," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "He tried to leave, but they wouldn't let him. When he disappeared, they came after us instead." James exhaled slowly, the pieces falling into place. These boys weren't just lost. They were being hunted. Their father had made enemies, and now his children were paying the price. A protective instinct James hadn't felt in years stirred inside him. He had spent most of his life looking out for himself, building his empire, making sure no one could ever put him in a position of weakness. But tonight, all of that seemed insignificant. Right now, these kids needed him, and he wasn't about to let them down. Just as he was about to speak, the distant sound of tires crunching on gravel sent a bolt of adrenaline through him. He moved to the window, peering out through the curtains. Headlights cut through the trees. They had found them. James's mind snapped into action. He turned to the younger boy. "Stay with your brother. Don't come out until I say." The boy nodded, eyes wide with fear. James stepped outside, the cold, morning air biting at his skin. The car rolled to a stop, and the same man from the alley stepped out, his expression unreadable. 2 others followed. James didn't wait for them to speak. "You've got the wrong kids," he said, his voice firm. "They don't have anything to do with whatever their father did." The man tilted his head, amused. "That's not your call to make." James clenched his jaw. "They're under my protection now, so if you want them, you'll have to go through me." For a long moment, no one moved. Rain dripped from the trees, the air thick with tension. Then, the man smirked. "You're a rich man, Mr. Carter," he said. "I doubt you're willing to throw all that away for a couple of kids you don't even know." James met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "Try me." The man studied him for a moment, then gave a slow, knowing nod. "All right," he said. "You want to play hero? Fine, but this isn't over." With that, he turned, motioning for his men to follow. They climbed back into the car. The engine rumbled to life, and within seconds, they were gone, disappearing, down the road like ghosts in the mist. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He knew this wasn't truly the end. Those men would be back. But for now, the boys were safe. When he stepped back inside, the younger one looked up at him, eyes filled with something that hadn't been there before. Hope. "Are we really safe now?" he asked quietly. James looked at the boys, then at the fading dawn outside. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear. "As long as I'm here," he said, "no one's going to hurt you." For the first time that night, the boy smiled, and for the first time in a long time, James felt like he had done something that truly mattered.